Welcome back to the Side Chat Podcast. This week I have Cobey will be with me, and we're going to be discussing the Grumman TBF and TBM Avenger. One of my favorite aircraft from one of my favorite companies. I'm kind of a Grumman fanboy, so I kind of nerd over this aircraft. When you look at the Avenger, it kind of doesn't look like much from the outside. It's probably one of the bigger warbirds you'll see, especially for something that has a single propeller.
Yeah, well, it's bigger than the P-47. Pretty damn big.
It's a big plane.
Yeah, at the time it was the biggest single-engine airplane to fly for carrier ever.
I'm looking forward to talking about this. Real quickly, thank you to everybody who contributed to the video that you will be seeing playing in the background. These are user replays that were submitted. And on the next podcast, it will be about the Ju-87 Stuka. So if you'd like to send in any gameplay for the Ju-87, either from War Thunder or IL-2 Battle Stalingrad, I would be happy to put that in for you. This podcast is going to focus a lot about torpedo bombers because that's what we're talking about, probably one of the most famous torpedo bombers of World War II. In World War I, torpedo bombing basically got its legs. The British and the Russians had pretty good success with it. In the 1930s, the U.S. Navy had an aircraft called the TBD Devastator. It saw action, of course, in the famous Battle of Midway. In November of 1939, the U.S. Navy approached several aircraft manufacturers about designing and building a replacement to the TBD Devastator. This was the most strict requirements that the Navy ever gave out for an aircraft, and most companies didn't even want to participate, was put that way. The two companies that kind of stepped up with designs was Vought and Grumman. Grumman proposed the XTBF-1, and Vought proposed the XTBU-1. The two aircraft are very similar. If you see pictures of them side by side, they actually look very, very, very comparable.
Yeah. So the specifications called for a 300-mile-an-hour airplane that could carry a torpedo or 4 500s internally in a bomb bay, and also had to have a powered turret. And the Avenger was the only airplane that met that. Actually, the Avenger was slow. It was slower than 300 miles an hour, but because it excelled in all the other ones so well, the Navy went ahead and accepted it.
The Navy put out a contract for both companies to build 2 prototypes each, and the Grumman engineers went to work, and they had the first aircraft built in 4 months' time, which I wish our defense industry moved that quick today.
No. 4 months is now 20 years.
The first prototype flew in 1941. On Thanksgiving Day, it went up for a flight over Long Island, and the pilot swear that he saw smoke in the cockpit, and so him and the gunner both bailed out of it. The aircraft crashed. Zero evidence of fire damage. What they suspect happened was that one of the hydraulic lines in the bomb bay broke, and that was what threw up something in the air. And
hydraulic fluid, when it atomizes, becomes a mist, and it looks a lot like smoke.
And so that's how the first prototype was lost, and that put Grumman behind the curveball quite a bit compared to Vought, because Vought had an aircraft now. Grumman's aircraft went to the ground. Team went back to work. They built the next aircraft in only 4 weeks' time by doing 110 hours a week. So on December 7th, 1941, kind of a famous date, right? Pearl Harbor. Grumman was having an open house. This is something they did every year for basically friends and family of the company. Kind of a big banquet thing, very fancy. TBF Avenger prototype number 2 that they just built was one of the showpieces for the event. And it was sitting right there. Everybody could see it. As the 15,000 guests were about to sit down to eat, over 3,000 cooked turkeys, roast beef, whatever you want to see, just a big Christmas dinner. Word got to them that Pearl Harbor happened. Grumman's security team kicked all 15,000 people out. So, due to the Pearl Harbor attack, the Navy was forced to pick between the Grumman or the Vought aircraft. And they put both these aircraft through rigorous testing. And Grumman eventually, of course, won the contract, but Vought was also given a contract to build what would be then called the Seawolf.
Yes, but Vought did not build the airplane.
Here's the problem, is you had Grumman now trying to build the Hellcat plus Wildcats, and you had Vought trying to build the Corsair. And now this is a company that, how many aircraft were they typically taking orders for? Like hundreds. Taking maybe hundreds at a time before the war. All of a sudden the U.S. Navy's like, we need thousands of Hellcats, thousands of Corsairs, thousands of Avengers, we want 2,000 Seawolves. Production just went crazy. They couldn't match what the Navy wanted. Both these companies basically had to outsource. Grumman was able to meet with General Motors and Washington, D.C. They decided that they were going to allow General Motors to build the TBF Avenger for them. Vought sold the aircraft to Consolidated, and Consolidated made a pretty big mess of it. They had a lot of production delays, and I think they only built 200 of the Seawolf before it was ultimately canceled. Those 200 or so aircraft never saw combat. They were just used as trainers. So if you've never heard of the Vought Seawolf, that's kind of why it never had a really big role in World War II other than a trainer. The Grumman aircraft went on to be built by General Motors through a sub-company called Eastern Aircraft. If Cobey wants to talk about kind of...
So Eastern Aircraft was a subsidiary of General Motors. GM had several idled factories due to the war, and decided that they were going to build airplanes. So they ended up hooking up with Grumman and ended up taking over all Wildcat production. They ended up taking over Avenger production after a little while, so that Grumman could concentrate on the Hellcat and then the Bearcat afterwards. But Grumman did something kind of nice to Eastern. Grumman really helped them out. They basically handed the Wildcat and the Avenger program and said, do with it as you wish. So Eastern tried to show that they could do a good job, dramatically improve the Wildcat immediately, and then over time improve the Avenger as well.
The Navy, by the way, I think was terrified that General Motors was building aircraft, and every aircraft that came out of those first batches, the Navy tested the crap out of trying to find any issues with, because they were terrified that planes being built by an automotive company were not going to meet the standard that they expected.
But luckily, Eastern very soon proved them wrong. They actually ended up being a very, very, very good airplane producer.
The main thing that Eastern did was they kind of combined what they learned from building pickup trucks and cars to aircraft assembly. So they took what Grumman did, and then they improved it with basically automotive technology, because at the time the U.S. was building cars. They kind of applied those same logistic manufacturing techniques to aircraft building. When we talk about the Avenger, you hear us say TBF and TBM. TBF Avenger is the ones that were built by Grumman, and then the TBM are the aircraft built by Eastern Aircraft. Most TBFs that you see flying today, air shows or in museums, are actually Eastern Aircraft TBMs.
And the reason why is because they built by far the most of them. I think Grumman only ended up building about 2,000 Avengers, but Eastern ended up building like 7,000 of them. So just by numbers alone, you're going to see more Eastern airplanes than you are Grumman airplanes.
We talked about how big the Avenger was earlier. The Avenger's propeller alone is over 13 feet tall. The wingspan is over 54 feet wide. And the cool thing about the wings was that they were able to fold and also rotate back, which is... It wasn't the first carrier plane in the world to have folding wings, but it was the first one, I believe, to have where it would fold up and then rotate back. So it wasn't sticking straight up in the air. The wings would fold backwards so it would have more vertical clearance.
Yep, that's right. And actually, Eastern applied the same mechanism to the Wildcat when the Wildcat got folding wings as well. And it's on the Hellcat as well.
Another thing that was very special about the Avenger was the undercarriage. It had one of the strongest undercarriage landing gear. To give you an idea of how strong this landing gear was, pilots would actually deploy it during flight as an air brake. If an Avenger was in trouble, it needed to lose, let's say, a 0 on its 6. There are documented cases of the Avenger going straight into a nosedive, deploying the landing gear to slow themselves, and then the 0 crashing. That's pretty standard for any aircraft built, after 1945, 1946?
I wouldn't say it's standard, but yeah, it happened quite a bit, yeah.
But for 1942, 1943, I think that's pretty...
Yeah, it was very advanced.
Land a heavy girl on an aircraft carrier over and over and over and over.
On a pitching deck going down away from you while you're flying at 80 miles an hour.
Another innovative feature that the TBF Avenger had was the ball turret located on the back of the aircraft.
The turret itself is totally self-contained. It was kind of a neat idea. It's all electric. It's all self-contained. There's no external, nothing on it. Everything that is inside the turret is inside the turret. It's pretty nice.
It just literally drops into the aircraft as one unit. The unit contains one 50 caliber machine gun, which has a 200 round box mag on it. He also had 2 other containers of ammo and the ball turret with him, so he had 600 rounds total. It had an illuminated gun sight, which is very fancy. It had its own gun camera. It had an oxygen regulator and flow indicator. It had its own radio control box, and it had a light form. It was powered by 2 24-volt electric motors that gave it all movement, elevation, and horizontal. The engine had 2 speed settings on it. Normally the turret would move about 15 to 20 degrees a second. There's a high speed switch on the back of the receiver of the M2 Browning machine gun that he could put into high mode. He could run high speed for about 20 minutes before the motors would burn up. On high speed, the turret would turn 30 to 45 degrees a second, which is insane. What is the advantages of a electric turret versus a, let's say, hand-powered turret? When you're flying an aircraft, let's say the Avenger is doing 200 miles an hour. When you try to swing the 50 caliber barrel to the left or right, there's a ton of force coming from the wind of the aircraft pushing the barrel back. So you'd almost have to be He-Man to turn the barrel all the way to the left. The gunner also sat on an armored seat, and then all the metal plating that you see around the bottom of the turret, that's also armored steel. Underneath the ball turret gunner, you have a very important position that I'm going to let Cobey explain to you as much as he can.
Well, the guy that sat there was by far the hardest working person on the entire airplane. He was the radio operator. He was the tunnel gunner, or sometimes called the stinger gun operator. And he was also the bombardier when they put bombs on the airplane. He had a Norden bomb sight back there.
And the belly of that aircraft is a Norden bomb sight, like Cobey mentioned. There is hundreds of pounds of radio equipment stuck underneath there. He couldn't see forward at all. He basically just had two little side windows, like Cobey mentioned, and then he could see out the back. So he had no idea what was going on, which had to be terrifying.
It's loud, and it's in the belly of the airplane, and yeah, it's just not a nice place to be.
That tunnel gunner had a 30 caliber machine gun, which had two different configurations. One configuration was a ammo box that would be fitted on the left side or right side of the fuselage. It would feed down through a roller system and into the gun. The other setup that they used was just a 30 cal with an ammo box that he would change out. There's another seat in the aircraft which is hard to explain, which is behind the pilot and in front of the ball turret. That seat was originally a co-pilot seat, I guess you call it?
Or a second pilot or a navigator, who knows. It had controls. The first 50 airplanes built had dual controls.
The first 50 aircraft were designed to fly with two pilots. They had an incident where the guy in the second seat accidentally messed up an engine setting, and we lost an aircraft to that, so those controls were abandoned for that reason. They caused more issues than they fixed. When the British eventually took order of the Avenger, they wanted that second seat turned into a navigator position. And then in later Avengers, that seat was basically almost deleted. I mean, it was still there. People could, I guess, do ride-alongs, but it did next to nothing except maybe as a navigator position.
Yeah, it was just a second seat, like an observer seat.
It was basically used for storage for radio equipment.
Yep.
The original Avenger was fitted with a 30 cal on the cowling. Later on, those were deleted for 250 cals installed in the wing root. That change first happened with a famous squadron called VT-10. They were not happy with the single 30 cal because when they attacked AAA positions, it did next to nothing, and they wanted the 250 cals so they could at least suppress or disable the anti-air positions as they needed to strafe them. On board the USS Enterprise, VT-10 and a Grumman representative went to work, and they adapted the aircraft to fire 250 caliber machine guns in the wing root. Grumman eventually adopted that change, and that would be the TBF-1C and on. The Avenger was the first U.S. Navy aircraft to receive zero-length rocket rails, which allowed this aircraft in the end to fire 50 caliber machine guns, rockets, drop its varying bomb loads, drop torpedoes, of course, mines, and depth charges. Later versions of the Avenger also had radar.
Yeah, so they had a anti-shipping radar that was installed on the right wing. It was a little tiny white dome-looking thing, and it proved very successful. Actually, they mostly used them in the Atlantic. At the time, we were U-boat hunting, and the Germans got smart and designed the snorkel that let them cruise right below the surface of water, but keeping a pipe up so that they could run their engines and run top speed underwater instead of relying on the batteries. But they were really hard to spot, and so we developed this radar that specifically looked for the snorkel, and the Avenger was the first airplane to carry it. Proved extremely, extremely successful.
So let's get into a little bit of combat history of the Avenger. This is where the aircraft really shined. The first squadron to receive the new aircraft was VT-8. The squadron flew about half TBFs and half TBD Devastators. This was during the war, of course, so they didn't want to take an entire squadron offline to do the changeover. So what would happen is half the squadron flew to the United States. They'd go pick up the aircraft. They went to Virginia, do some training. They would fly all the way to San Diego, do some more training, went to Hawaii, do more conversion training, and then they would fly out to the aircraft carrier. When the second half of the TBD pilots went to go for their conversion training on the TBF, a little thing called Battle of Midway happened. When the U.S. knew that the Battle of Midway was happening, they asked the TBF pilots who were at Hawaii doing their conversion training if they would like to volunteer for a mission, because the ragtag group of aircraft that Midway needed all the help they can get. So 6 TBFs and their crews volunteered. They flew from Hawaii to Midway. They took a handful of reservists with them because they needed somebody who knew how to get to Midway, which was a very problematic thing because these were guys who, they were reservists. They weren't the normal crews that they were working with. Well, none of them made it. We'll put it that way. And it also led to some other communication and just, I guess they call it protocol issues. So it was an 8-hour flight. They landed on June 1st, 1942, so they had 3 days before the Japanese fleet would arrive. When the Japanese fleet was spotted on June 4th, 1942, the 6 TBF Avengers were the first aircraft in the air off of Midway Island. The Avengers were the first aircraft to run into the Japanese, and it's figured that they were outnumbered somewhere between 3 to 1, and the Zeros just had their way with the poor Avengers. The Avengers were only able to drop 3 torpedoes on target, 0 damage. Only 1 aircraft was able to escape.
And it barely made it back to Midway. It was all shot to shit.
Turret gunner was dead. He lost hydraulic pressure. When the Avenger loses hydraulic pressure, the rear tail wheel will drop. When the rear tail wheel drops because it has no hydraulic pressure, it then blocks the tail gunner because there's a landing gear in his face. The aircraft had no flaps. His bomb bay door was jammed open. The pilot had shrapnel in his knee. He was able to navigate his way back to Midway because he saw the smoke coming up from the oil tanks that the Japanese destroyed. The pilot thought about bailing out of the aircraft, but he had no clue if the tail gunner was still alive or not. They had no way of communicating because they lost their intercom. So he decided that he would belly land the aircraft on the airfield. The aircraft landed. The tail gunner had minimal injuries.
Yep, and there's actually only one other survivor of VT-8 that was actually at Midway, George Gay. I'm sure everyone's heard about him. He was the guy that was in a Devastator that was plopped in the ocean and then grabbed onto his seat and floated next to the Japanese fleet as they floated right by him. Luckily, they didn't see him. He was the only other guy from VT-8 to live.
3 guys from VT-8 total between the Devastators and Avengers. The Navy took a hard look at the Avenger after this. This was their new, brand spanking new aircraft that was going to change everything for them. Eventually, the Navy kind of wisened up and they realized that no aircraft could... There'd be no bomber that would be able to fly into combat without proper fighter coverage. The Avenger did nothing wrong at Midway, it just had no help. The Royal Navy's Fleet Air Arm received its first Avengers in January of 1943. They were desperate for any new carrier aircraft they could get. They really need to replace the Swordfish. And if you compare the Swordfish to the Avenger, that's a pretty good upgrade.
Yeah, it's night and day. Well, the British actually kind of made the airplane their own. When we delivered the airplane, they were flown to Scotland, and all the American gear was ripped out, and all the British gear was put in. So they can't get all the American radios, put in British radios. The radio operator down below got bubble windows instead of the flat windows that we had, so he could actually stick his head out of the airplane but still be inside the window, which was kind of nice. The British originally ordered the airplane under the name Tarpon. They received basically TBF-1s, and then they got TBM-1Cs, and then finally TBM-3s. When they received the -3s, they changed the name to the Avenger because at that time they wanted to follow the American names, just like with the Corsair. They ended up naming the Corsair the Corsair. British didn't hold on to them very long. Pretty much right after the war, they dumped them all immediately, and most of those ended up in Canada and in Brazil and all sorts of places all over the world. The British pretty much sold them to whoever would buy them.
The British were replacing them with Fireflies and a bunch of other aircraft that they had. The British were finally getting the aircraft that they were designed for World War II after World War II, so they had to make room.
All right, so the Americans learned a pretty valuable lesson in the Atlantic, and they learned that you could kill U-boats with rockets. So what they did is they put British rocket rails on the Avenger, and they also rigged up a fuel tank in the bomb bay that basically doubled fuel capacity of the airplane, so they could fly it for a lot longer now. And they would go around hunting for U-boats, and if they found them, especially if they found them on the surface, which is pretty common, most U-boats only submerged when they were attacking back then, they were able to rocket the U-boats, and that destroyed most of them. The Americans ended up actually operating escort carriers as anti-submarine units all over the Atlantic, attached to convoys and everything else like that. There was typically a smaller escort carrier, and they had a handful of Avengers and a handful of Wildcats. That's it. So they were all Grumman airplanes.
A typical little hunter squadron was 2 Wildcats for 1 Avenger.
The fighters were there really just to strafe the U-boats. They became very successful at that, actually. We'd rocket them to where they couldn't submerge, and then the Wildcats would come in and kind of strafe them if they tried to shoot back using their deck gun.
Both the British and the Americans used the Avenger quite extensively in the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean. I'd say the Avenger is probably most famous today due to its work in the Pacific Ocean. For a big, heavy bomber, it actually had a 2.5 or higher a kill ratio against enemy aircraft. That's pretty impressive for a big, heavy, slow bomber.
Yeah, it was pretty maneuverable airplane. It really was. It was quite surprising.
The Avenger was a very successful torpedo bomber. It was a mediocre high-altitude bomber. I believe most success from it doing level bombing was on things like airfields, big targets. Even though it had a Norn bomb sight, bombing ships is something that's it's quite difficult when you're at 15,000 feet plus. That's why dive bombing, that's why the Dauntless, I think, probably did a much greater job at bombing ships than the Avenger was going to ever do. But the Avenger bombed a lot of airfields, so the Norn bomb sight was useful. I do recall, though, they took the bomb sight out of a lot of the aircraft. It just wasn't really necessary.
They did, yeah. Horizontal bombing of ships is not very good. It's very hard to hit a bomb horizontally.
You're in a moving plane hitting a moving target.
Yeah.
Although we did lose a lot of Avengers to a lot of issues, the British had a small issue where their aircraft carriers were not designed for a heavy, big airplane like this. And if you hit the last wire on a British carrier, you're typically going into the nets or out the side of the deck. On the American carriers, you had a lot of issues. You had, of course, accidents happen. You had planes that fell short, planes that went long. You had planes that got lost. You had all kinds of issues. Operating an aircraft over the ocean is extremely dangerous. After the Marianas Turkey shoot, you had everybody trying to return back to the aircraft carriers. Carriers were not shooting up big spotlights and saying, hey, we're over here, because they're trying to hide. And you had pilots who were lost. There's some Avengers still to this day that we don't know what happened to. We assume that they had to ditch in the pitch black night and were never recovered, never found. They were supposed to be running radio silent that night, and they had to turn off their radios because there were Avenger pilots that were completely losing their mind, screaming on the radio due to, they basically knew they were dead. The Avenger was not a dive bomber in any sense. It cannot dive bomb. It would break apart. There were later versions of the TBM that were going to be strengthened so that they could do dive bombing. That aircraft was canceled due to the end of the war. So the only thing they could kind of do was like a low angle, like slope bombing as you call it, but it could never actually dive bomb or do any type of aggressive bombing. So the biggest problem that the Avenger really faced during World War II would be the Torpedo, which was its main weapon system, was the Mark 13 Torpedo, which had a lot of issues. If you play War Thunder and you see the American Torpedo has this wood thing over its nose and a wood thing over its fins, that's not there for fashion, I guess I'll say. It's not an accessory for the Torpedo. That was a necessity. The Torpedo that the U.S. dropped liked to drown a lot.
Yeah, it was actually a terrible airplane. And they did a study. They were having such a problem with the Torpedo that they actually commissioned the scientists at Caltech, California Technical University down in L.A., to do a study on the Torpedo to see what they could do to improve it. And they did a study and found out that more than 50% of the torpedoes dropped on any given run at any given time sunk immediately. Didn't even start the engine. They just fell and sunk immediately. What they found out is that when they were hitting the water, they were oscillating and they were going out of control and sinking. So they developed a interim solution, which was basically a plywood box around the tail and a plywood nose cone that broke up once it hit the water, and then once it got straight, it went going, it was fine. Well, Caltech ended up spending a year developing this improvement for the Torpedo, and basically all it was a ring around the propeller that dramatically increased the serviceability and the reliability of the Torpedo. It went from like 50% failure to like 10% failure first time out. A great improvement, but it took great scientific minds to do it.
When I was actually reading about this, it said that Caltech was given a blank check to figure this out.
Yeah, it was such an important thing to the U.S. War effort that Caltech. That's really kind of how Caltech built their reputation was doing that kind of project.
And the new torpedo came online, what, 1944, 1945? It was
1944. Yeah, it's the Mark 13 was our standard torpedo. I believe the one with the ring on it was the Mark 13A or Mod 1, kind of depending on what kind of reference material you read, and it was the standard torpedo throughout the rest of the war.
But the war was, let's say, almost over at that point. It would have been nice to have in 1942, 1943, when the big naval battles were going down.
Yeah, would have been really nice, yeah.
You're an Avenger pilot flying really low, really slow, head on at a Japanese ship that has AA and small arms firing at you. And you're just going, well, 50% chance this works.
That's the problem. You're not going to know until you end up pulling the trigger and dropping it and see what happens. I don't know. It did its job. It did it really, really, really well, and that was it. I mean, it survived the war. Of course, the last U.S. Avengers were flown by the reserves until like 1960. Quite a long time after that. I honestly think post-war is really when the Avenger starts to kind of come into its own.
Well, before we talk about post-war, let's talk about two famous Avenger pilots.
Okay.
Cobey last night learned that Paul Newman was an Avenger guy.
Yep, he was a radio operator. Did not know that. He was actually in for pilot training, but found out he was colorblind, and then they booted him out and made him a radio operator, and he served with an Avenger squadron.
George Bush Sr. flew the Avenger during World War II. I don't know how many people might know that, but if you're from Texas, you learned that in elementary school, that former President of the United States flew the Avenger. He was the youngest naval pilot at the time. Is that record?
He was just shy over 18 years old when he got his wings in Pensacola.
And he crashed twice into the ocean. Of course, he was recovered and lived on because he became a president later. But that's a very famous. That's what they tell the kids in Texas. That's how I first learned about the Avenger. I had no idea what an Avenger was, but they're like, George Bush flew the Avenger in World War II. I'm like, oh, okay. Telling a 6-year-old that. So the Avenger made it through the war. It was several aircraft tried to replace it. You had the Helldiver.
Yeah, which did not do a very good job at all to begin with, let alone replace the Avenger.
You had the BTD that tried to replace it. It never got produced enough numbers.
Yep.
You had the Skyraider that was going to replace it. And the old girl kicked around to the 1960s.
All right, so post-war is really where the Avenger kind of really comes into its own. So the Navy had a bunch of them left over, and they modified a bunch of them to be anti-submarine airplanes because that was a big threat now, was the Russian submarine threat that was being developed in the late 40s. The Avenger had a very unique thing going for it. It had a big giant nothing in the inside. The fuselage inside was huge. If you took out all the garbage and all the crap and took off the turret, you had this huge volume of area you could use. One of the things that they used was as a carrier onboard delivery airplane, or COD airplane. It was actually the very first COD airplane developed by the Navy, the TBM-3R. They put bench seats in there, and you could carry 7 people inside the airplane. And they also developed a really nice basket system where they would put this basket in the bomb bay. They could fill it up with all sorts of cargo and all sorts of freight and all sorts of other crap like that. And they could deliver supplies directly to the carrier from land very, very, very quickly. The basket itself was actually designed by a chief petty officer who was short on manpower and short on time one day, and instead of just manually loading up mail in the airplane, he went home and overnight sketched up this idea for this basket, took it to his superiors who immediately approved it, and they put it into production at NAS Alameda, which is in Oakland, California. And it became the standard for the COD for a long time. So what you would do is you would load up the basket, they'd open up the bomb bay doors, they'd winch up the basket, close the bomb bay doors, and fly off. It made loading and unloading much, 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 much faster. The other thing that it did was had hunter-killer groups for anti-submarine warfare. The TBM-3R and 3S and 3W were the hunter killer airframes. The 3W had a big giant AN/APS-20 radar mounted in a big giant turtle-shaped kind of guppy-looking thing. If you turn the airplane upside down, it looked like a turtle. It had like a turtle shell kind of. They would fly out ahead of the killers and spot submarines, and then they would radio back via a secured data link to the airplanes that had torpedoes and bombs and depth charges and rockets, and they would send them in. They would control them to exactly where the submarine was and kill them.
Real quick interjection.
Yep.
So, really funny fact is the planes that Cobey's describing, the British had to take delivery of more Avengers to replace their anti-submarine fleet. Yeah. So, even though the British tried to get rid of the Avenger in 1946, in the mid-1950s they took a whole bunch more for delivery. For this reason.
Yep, so they did that. They were very successful at that. Extremely successful. In fact, actually, the last airplane that was flown was a COD airplane, the 3R, by the reserves up until 1960. All throughout the Korean War, the Avenger was the main COD airplane and the main anti-submarine warfare airplane for the entire fleet up until really the Grumman S2 tracker came in, which was in 1955, 56. So it soldiered on a lot longer than it did during the war, of course. And also at the same time, they became surplus and they started selling them to all sorts of companies. The Canadians really bought a bunch of them and turned them into firebombers. And they flew as firebombers up until, I think, the last season was 2001. They flew up in Canada for, I think in Nova Scotia, maybe? I don't remember where it was, but yeah, they flew them up there for a long time, dropping water. We also had them in California, in Washington, and Oregon, and Idaho, all sorts of places. It was a really popular post-war firebomber.
It was also the first plane that Japan got for their Japanese defense forces.
That's correct. Yeah, the very first airplane that they received after the war was a squadron of Avengers, and they flew them up until the mid '60s actually. Till we gave them trackers.
The Royal Netherlands Navy received 50 of them in 1953, and they served until 1964. The French got 3 squadrons after the war. The Canadians actually sucked up almost every British Avenger and brought it back to Canada for firefighting.
And they use them themselves too as anti-submarine warfare, anti-submarine warfare airplanes. The British gave the Canadians a bunch of carriers after the war as kind of a thank you for helping them out, and they basically took exactly what the British had and used them for a long time. It was a good airplane. It was extremely versatile. It was kind of the Navy's first real catch-all, do everything, whatever it was asked of airplane, and it's an extremely popular airplane today. As a matter of fact, most of the warbirds that are flying around now are old firebomber airplanes. They're just really good airplanes. They're extremely strong, extremely reliable. They're huge. If you ever get a chance to go to an air show and see one, just go take a look at them. They're just massive Machu airplanes. Just massive airplanes.
You literally can't miss it.
Yeah, you cannot miss them.
So if you have any questions about the TBF or TBM Avenger, we will be happy to answer them in the comment section below. Once again, thank you for listening. I will once again repeat that we are looking for Ju-87 Stuka footage. If you want to send that in to bohicaice@gmail.com, I would greatly appreciate that. Thank you for listening, and we will catch you next time.